In the grand chessboard of nations, moves are rarely made with a shoot more often. They're whispered in the corridors of power. Canada, often seen as the quiet neighbor, made a move so subtle yet so devastating, it sent ripples across the American economy. With tariffs, they didn't just level the playing field, they tilted it in their favor. The US numbers stumbled, markets trembled, but Canada stood taller than ever. This is the untold story of a nation's silent power play, and how quiet strength can roar louder than the noisiest threats. Strategic timing of Canada's tariff implementation. Impact on US export-dependent industries. Strengthening Canada's domestic manufacturing sector. Boost in Canadian global trade partnerships. Shift in North American economic power dynamics. When Canada chose to implement its tariffs, it wasn't a decision made in haste or born from impulsive reaction. It was the product of patience, analysis, and a keen understanding of timing in global economics. In trade wars, just like in battles on the field, the moment you strike often matters more than the strike itself. Canada watched the currents of the global market, studied the patterns of US export cycles, and waited until the moment when American industries were most reliant on Canadian markets. By holding off until the dependency had quietly deepened, they ensured that the impact would be both immediate and difficult to counter. This wasn't an act of aggression for the sake of posturing. It was a calculated maneuver aimed at maximizing leverage. Timing in trade is about more than just numbers. It's about human behavior, about how markets react under pressure, about when political will is strong enough to make hard decisions and when it's stretched thin by other challenges. Canada knew that the US was navigating multiple economic fronts, balancing internal political disputes, and managing tensions with other trading partners. To make a move when your opponent is distracted is not deception. It is strategy. And that's exactly what happened. When the tariffs were announced, they didn't land like a single thunderclap. They came as a series of rolling waves, each one hitting a slightly different sector, each one designed to disrupt supply chains in ways that couldn't be instantly repaired. This slow, deliberate rollout compounded the effect, forcing US exporters to feel the strain not all at once, but over weeks and months. The delay between cause and full effect ensured that American industries couldn't mount an effective, unified response. By the time the reality of the situation became clear, the damage was already in motion. Canada's timing was also about opportunity. Striking at a moment when alternative markets were already opening up for them. They weren't simply closing the door on the United States. They were stepping through a different one that led to stronger ties with Europe, Asia, and emerging economies eager for reliable trade partners. The genius wasn't just in hitting when it hurt, but in hitting when there was already a soft landing prepared for themselves. It was the quiet confidence of a country that understood the rhythm of the global market and chose to play its note exactly when it would resonate the loudest. US export-dependent industries felt the brunt of Canada's tariffs in ways that statistics alone could never fully capture. For many of these sectors, Canada wasn't just another buyer on the list. It was a primary market, a dependable neighbor whose trade routes were short, costs were low, and demand was steady. When those tariffs came into effect, they acted like a sudden tightening of a valve in a system that relied on constant, unimpeded flow. Goods that had once crossed the border effortlessly were now burdened with added costs, making them less competitive almost overnight. The math for many American producers changed in an instant, and with it, their strategies, their prices, and in some cases, their survival. Industries like steel, aluminum, agricultural products, and manufactured goods were particularly exposed. A U.S. farmer who had spent years building relationships with Canadian buyers suddenly found their products priced higher than similar goods from Europe or South America. An American machinery manufacturer that had counted on predictable Canadian orders each quarter now faced canceled contracts or renegotiations at lower volumes. These weren't abstract numbers shifting on a chart. They were workers losing overtime, a plant scaling back production, and small businesses scrambling to find alternative customers in unfamiliar markets. The ripple effect spread quickly. Shipping companies that specialized in cross-border deliveries saw routes cut back. Suppliers and service providers who depended on the health of export, heavy businesses found their own orders slowing. What made the blow even sharper was that the industries hit hardest were often located in areas already struggling to adapt to broader economic changes. For them, losing a reliable trading partner like Canada wasn't just a setback. It was a threat to local economies. Canada's move also had a psychological impact. U.S. exporters had long seen their neighbor to the north as a stable and friendly partner, not a source of significant trade friction. When that trust was disrupted, it introduced a layer of uncertainty that made businesses cautious about future planning. Investments were delayed, expansions were put on hold, and hiring slowed as companies tried to read the new landscape. For Canada, the tariffs were a strategic tool. For U.S. export-dependent industries, they were a sudden and painful reminder that in global trade, even the closest allies can become tough negotiators when their national interests are on the line. The result was a shift in confidence, market share, and the very assumptions that had guided cross-border commerce for decades. Canada's tariffs didn't just serve as a defensive move in a trade dispute. They became a catalyst for strengthening the country's domestic manufacturing sector. When imported goods from the U.S. suddenly became more expensive, Canadian buyers, from large corporations to individual consumers, began looking inward. Products that might have previously been sourced from across the border were now being considered from domestic suppliers. And that shift in demand created fertile ground for Canadian manufacturers to expand their operations. For years, certain Canadian industries had struggled to compete with the sheer scale and pricing power of U.S. producers. Lower costs south of the border often meant Canadian companies had to fight for every contract, sometimes compromising on profitability to stay relevant. The tariffs effectively leveled that playing field, making homegrown products more attractive both in terms of price and accessibility. This wasn't just about replacing imports. It was about giving Canadian manufacturers the breathing room to innovate, scale up, and improve efficiency without being constantly undercut. The results began to emerge quickly. Factories that had been operating at partial capacity started adding shifts. Skilled tradespeople found new opportunities as production lines grew busier. Small and medium-sized manufacturers, often the backbone of local economies, were able to invest in better equipment, hire more staff, compete for contracts that had once seemed out of reach. It was an economic ripple that started with tariffs, but extended into communities, creating jobs and reinforcing the value of a strong domestic production base. Beyond immediate growth, there was also a strategic long-term effect. Canadian companies became more motivated to diversify their product lines and explore export opportunities outside of the U.S. The mindset shifted from merely surviving in the shadow of a larger neighbor to actively building resilience against future disruptions. Research and development saw increased funding as companies looked to create higher value products that could stand out in competitive markets. Government policies played a supporting role, offering incentives for manufacturing expansion and encouraging partnerships between private industry and educational institutions to strengthen the skills pipeline. What began as a response to an economic challenge evolved into a broader vision for industrial independence. By reducing reliance on imports and investing in its own capacity, Canada wasn't just weathering the storm. It was building a stronger, more self-sufficient manufacturing sector that could thrive long after the trade dispute faded from the headlines. One of the most significant outcomes of Canada's tariff strategy was the boost it gave to the country's global trade partnerships. While the immediate effect was to challenge U.S. dominance in certain sectors, the longer-term impact was to push Canada toward deeper engagement with other markets. The tariffs didn't just close one door, they created the urgency and opportunity to open several others. By redirecting its focus, Canada strengthened existing agreements and sought out new ones, ensuring that its economic growth was not tied too tightly to any single trading partner. Beyond the economic benefits, these strengthened partnerships also enhanced Canada's diplomatic influence. Countries that saw Canada as a reliable, rules-based trading partner were more inclined to cooperate on broader issues. From climate initiatives to technology sharing, trade relationships became the foundation for deeper political and cultural connections, expanding Canada's role on the global stage. The domestic perception of trade also began to shift. Businesses that had once relied heavily on the U.S. started thinking more globally, investing in market research, adapting products to meet international standards, and building relationships with overseas distributors. Exporters became more agile, ready to pivot toward being best opportunities rather than being bound to a single market out of habit or convenience. In the end, the tariffs acted as a forcing mechanism, accelerating Canada's push toward a more diversified and globally connected economy. By embracing new partnerships and strengthening old ones, Canada turned a challenge into a strategic advantage. Ensuring its economic future was anchored not in dependency, but in choice. The shift in North American economic power dynamics following Canada's tariff move was subtle at first, but over time it became impossible to ignore. For decades, the U.S. had been the unquestioned economic heavyweight in the region, setting the pace for trade, dictating terms in negotiations, and enjoying a position of influence that few challenged. Canada, while prosperous and respected, often played the role of the cooperative partner, a steady presence, but rarely the one steering the direction of regional economics. The tariffs marked a turning point in that balance. By taking decisive action that directly affected U.S. industries, Canada demonstrated that it was not merely a supporting actor in the North American economy. It showed it had the capacity, the will, and the strategic insight to protect its own interests, even if that meant standing firm against its largest trading partner. This recalibration of roles sent a signal, both domestically and internationally, that Canada was willing to engage in economic maneuvering at the highest level. The U.S., accustomed to its dominant position, found itself adjusting to a new reality, where its northern neighbor had more leverage than before. Canadian industries, strengthened by domestic growth and diversified trade partnerships, were less vulnerable to U.S. economic pressure. This shift didn't dethrone the U.S. as the regional leader, but it narrowed the gap in influence, creating a more balanced dynamic that was unprecedented in recent history. For other countries watching, this change was instructive. It showed that smaller economies within a major trade bloc could assert themselves and achieve tangible results without collapsing under pressure. This boosted Canada's credibility in future negotiations, both within North America and beyond. Partners began to view Canada not just as a gateway to the U.S. market, but as a powerful and independent economic force in its own right. At home, the move fostered a sense of confidence. Businesses and policymakers began to think in terms of what Canada could demand, rather than only what it could offer. That subtle shift in mindset, from reactive to proactive, was perhaps the most profound change of all. The balance of economic power in North America was no longer a one-sided equation. Canada had proven it could not only withstand pressure from its most powerful neighbor, but also emerge stronger, more independent, and more respected in the process. In the end, Canada's tariff strategy was never just about numbers on a spreadsheet or headlines in the financial press. It was about positioning, about understanding that economic strength is not only measured in raw GDP, but in the ability to make bold, calculated moves that protect your interests and expand your influence. Through precise timing, Canada struck when the conditions were most favorable, ensuring that the immediate impact was felt and the long-term advantages were secured. The tariffs disrupted U.S. export-dependent industries, not out of spite, but as a clear message that Canada would not simply absorb the costs of an imbalanced trade relationship. What followed was a remarkable period of internal growth. Domestic manufacturing, once under constant competitive strain, found room to breathe and thrive. Jobs were created, industries expanded, innovation accelerated. Canada didn't just shield itself from harm. It used the moment to strengthen its economic foundations. At the same time, doors opened to new global partnerships. Trade agreements that had long been secondary in focus became pillars of a more diversified and resilient economy, spreading Canada's influence far beyond its borders. Perhaps the most profound outcome was the shift in North America's economic balance. Canada emerged from the dispute not as a silent partner, but as a strategic player capable of challenging assumptions and shaping the terms of engagement. The world took notice, and so did its own citizens. Confidence grew, not in a boastful way, but with the steady assurance that comes from proving your strength in the face of challenge. This was not the story of a loud, aggressive confrontation. It was the story of quiet precision, of a nation that understood that power often lies in the moves that are least expected yet most effective. In the global game of trade, Canada reminded everyone that even the smallest shifts made at the right time can alter the entire balance of the board. And in doing so, it left a lasting lesson that resilience, vision, and the courage to act decisively can transform a moment of pressure into a defining chapter of national strength.